Thanks, Georgia. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Let me just get this going here. Okay. So as Georgia said, I'm a movement disorder neurologist right up the road in Baton Rouge. I'm from New Orleans, grew up here in the West Bank mainly. I do admit that, yes I do. And then I went to undergrad at LSU, studied engineering actually, and then went on to medical school and into neurology, and loved movement disorders, and I did a fellowship in Birmingham, and I've been in Baton Rouge since. So now I'm going to talk today about something that's very near and dear to my heart, something I enjoy very much, is treating patients with botulinum toxin. Like Georgia said, we call it Botox sometimes, and it's kind of a generic term just because, like you say, Kleenex for facial tissues, but there are actually 4 toxins, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And you might see the abbreviation BTX instead of botulinum toxin, writing it out. So botulinum toxin is a poison. It's made by a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. It's been around since the dawn of man. This bacteria is everywhere, so we don't usually get infected with it or symptoms of it because our immune system fights it so well in vast majority of cases. But it's everywhere, and the bacteria thrives under conditions of low or no oxygen, so it's called an anaerobic bacteria. The toxin, as we know, causes weakness and paralysis, and if it gets to a point where it affects the respiratory muscles enough, then it can cause respiratory failure and even death. So really there's 3 main types of infections that humans get. Infants can get it because their immune system's not really developed enough to fight it. That's why you probably know not to feed infants honey. That's one place it can kind of live. But food botulism is how most humans have acquired it over the years and centuries. You can get it through a wound infection. That's usually people who are just very sick and just don't take care of themselves very well. But in terms of food, getting it nowadays, you can get it from improperly canning food is one of the most common ways it's still around, but not very common at all. Like I said, it's been around a long time. It just wasn't recognized. We didn't know what bacteria was until I think the 1600s. So it took a while to figure it out. Of course, anecdotally, we knew over the years not to do certain things, and that became part of our food taboos in a way. Not eating certain kind of sausages, not eating uncooked meat, things like that. So botulism is when you have the bacteria growing in your body and it releases the toxin, and then you can get the weakness from it. And these are the kinds of weakness that you get. It can affect the eyes and cause double vision. It can cause droopy eyelids. It can affect the facial muscles. Then it can affect the speech, swallowing problems, and then moves to affect the bigger muscles of the body, the arms and the legs. You can get generalized weakness in the arms and legs. And then finally, as I said, when it gets into the respiratory muscles, then you're in real trouble. So a little bit of history here. Justinus Kerner was a poet, actually, but he was also the chief medical officer for a small town in Germany, and he liked sausages, as you can see. He was a sausage expert. But they had outbreaks of botulism, and they were trying to figure out what was causing it. And he did a very good job of characterizing these and kind of doing case studies. And he sort of figured out that he thought that there was a poison blocking neuromuscular transmission. He had some other ideas that were not correct, as you can see on the bottom right there. But he made this statement. He said the capacity of nerve conduction is interrupted by the toxin in the same way that electrical conductor is by rust. And he was pretty much right there, and that was a long time ago, a couple hundred years ago. So this is a picture of the bacteria. It's a rod-shaped bacteria, gram-positive rod, which just means under a certain kind of dye you can see it. So a gram-positive rod that lives under anaerobic conditions. And so here, I'm going to explain what this is. So on the upper left-hand corner here, what we're looking at is, think about a nerve connecting to a muscle. So if my finger is the nerve and my hand is the muscle, that area is called the neuromuscular junction where they meet. That's where the nerve gives the signal to the muscle for the muscle to fire. And so that's what we're seeing here. Here's my finger and here's my hand. So this square is a blow up of that area, the neuromuscular junction, and that's what this big area is here. So this top part here, this is the end of the nerve, okay? It's a nerve terminus. And what we're looking at here in the bottom is some muscle cells. So this is where the nerve up here connects to the muscle, and there's actually a little gap here in between. It's millionths of a meter or billionths of a meter, very tiny, but there is a little cleft there. And the way that our nerves tell our muscles to fire or contract is through these chemicals that are in these vesicles. There's a chemical called acetylcholine. And when the body wants a muscle to fire, the nerve sends a signal. And when the signal gets down here, it will cause these vesicles to merge with the end plate wall, releases the chemical that were inside these vesicles. The neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, goes across this space and it hits these receptors, and then the muscle fires. Okay, so it's pretty amazing how this happens. And every time any muscle fires in your body, this is going on. And in fact, the muscle can do this 50 times per second or more. So it happens extremely fast, very efficient. And what Botox does, all the botulinum toxins, they affect how these vesicles merge with this membrane to release the chemical. So Botox actually cuts this right here, the SNAP-25. Most of the botulinum toxins work there. They cut this. So then when this is cut, then these balls of chemical cannot go into the cleft and the signal cannot get transmitted. And that's exactly what happens. We're going to watch, what happened to the video? I think it's after this slide. This is a three-dimensional view of what the botulinum toxin molecule looks like. There's what they call a heavy chain, just because it's bigger and heavier, and there's a light chain. They have different functions. The heavy chain kind of allows the toxin to get into the cell, into the nerve terminus, and then the light chain is the one that cuts that enzyme, the SNAP-25 enzyme. And we'll see a video of that right here. Is the sound off? I guess we'll find out. So this video kind of shows us...
Botulinum toxin type A binds to the motor nerve terminal. The binding domain of the type A molecule appears to be the heavy chain, which is selective for cholinergic nerve terminal. The toxin binds with high affinity to the motor neuron. Botulinum toxin type A is internal.
Now stop here. I'm going to show you. Watch here. These chemicals are going to be released across into the muscle here. So what we're looking at, this is the end of the nerve, and this is the muscle down here. And you're going to see that these chemicals are going to be released across the cleft into the muscle. That's going to cause the muscle to fire. That's what's going to happen normally. But up here we have some Botox coming in. After you get injected, this is what happens. This is the toxin. It gets internalized through endocytosis into the nerve terminus, and then you're going to see what it does here in a second.
Via receptor-mediated endocytosis, a process in which the plasma membrane of the nerve cell invaginates around the toxin receptor complex, forming a toxin-containing vesicle inside the nerve terminal. After internalization, the light chain of the toxin molecule, which has been demonstrated to contain the transmission-blocking domain, is released into the cytoplasm of the nerve terminal.
Here's the active part here.
Botulinum toxin type A blocks acetylcholine release by cleaving SNAP-25, a cytoplasmic protein that is located on the cell membrane and that is required for the release of this transmitter. The affected terminals are inhibited from stimulating muscle contraction. The toxin does not affect the synthesis or storage of acetylcholine or the conduction of electrical signals along the nerve fiber.
So now the signal can't be transmitted because that toxin came in and sort of cut the grass there, and now those vesicles cannot transmit. Here's a little bit of a timeline about how botulinum toxin was developed. Very interesting story. Ed Shantz was a junior Army officer at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and the Army had a top secret unit that they were investigating botulinum toxins. They actually wanted to make antibodies because they were afraid other companies would use it for chemical warfare. So they wanted to make antibodies to all the toxins. And so he was studying it, but they had to purify the toxin in order to make the antibodies. So they really had to study it, and the Army really helped start that. And then they learned how to purify it and kind of isolate it. Here's the toxin here, this yellow part and this green part. There's some proteins that are around the toxin to help stabilize it. They kind of figured all that out and isolated it. And then Dr. Alan Scott was a ophthalmologist, an eye surgeon in California. He was interested in treating some eye conditions like strabismus, which is where the eyes are not aligned properly and people have double vision. And he was interested in treating that non-surgically because before that they would just cut or alter the muscles around the eye to fix it. So he had some animal models. He had some monkeys with strabismus. He wanted to try out some toxins. He started asking around. He found Ed Shantz, and Ed Shantz was able to give him some toxin and was giving it to people all around the world actually to study. But Dr. Scott really proved that it could work in animals. He started doing that in the 60s and 70s. And then he had to get clearance from the FDA in the 70s to use it on humans. That was a big step because up until then, nobody had been looking at that in humans, and so the FDA had to develop a new policy to even do those kind of studies. Finally, in 1977, he started injecting it in humans, which took very big kahunas in my opinion, but he did it, and it worked very well. And by the early 1980s, they started using it in other conditions. 1983, he submitted data, or 85, submitted all the data to the FDA, but it took 4 years for the FDA to approve it in humans. That finally came in December 1989. So here's another kind of a timeline. 80s started using it in humans, got approved in 1989 for strabismus and blepharospasm. 1997, another improved formulation came out, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And in 2000, it got approved for cervical dystonia. 2002, got approved for cosmetics, which is what most people, when you think and say Botox, most people think about cosmetic stuff, right? Most people don't realize it's really been used for medical purposes since the late 80s, mid to late 80s. So they had the old formulation of Botox was here, and in 1997 they refined it so that it had much less protein particles in the vial, which improved the chances that you would get antibodies. So people got much less antibodies to the toxin after it was reformulated. Here's another kind of timeline of the indications. 1989, we mentioned that was really the first. But even though it was only approved for blepharospasm and strabismus here, really right when it came out, doctors started using it for all these other things, especially cervical dystonia and spasticity. But it took a number of years for it to formally get approved in those indications. And then in 2011, 2013, a couple of bladder indications. 2010, chronic migraine. We talked about how these, I think this is a build slide here. We've got there's some proteins in nature, when this toxin occurs, these proteins help to stabilize it. May not be important, though, for the Botox that we get in the clinic. So there's actually different subtypes of this bacteria that make different strains of the toxin, and they're lettered A through G. Well, A is the best one and best suited for medical treatment. B is also used too. I want to point out that since these are biological compounds, companies don't have a right to the molecule. They just have a right to the manufacturing process. So there's 3 type A toxins on the market, which I'll talk about in a second. They're all exactly the same molecule. They just have different name brands because different companies process it in a different way, and they have approval to do it that way. But these will never go generic because it's a biological molecule. By far, botulinum toxin, most potent toxin known to man. LD50 is the what they call the amount that will be a lethal dose to 50% of individuals, and we're talking about that lethal dose for botulinum toxin to be in the order of 200 to 300 nanograms, which is billionths of a gram. It's hard to fathom. A single gram of pure toxin could theoretically kill more than 1 million people, which is very scary. The next most potent toxin is arsenic, and it's 6 orders or 1 million times less toxic. So it's number one by a little bit. And a couple years ago, they found a new strain of botulinum toxin, the strain H, and it's actually the most potent of all. The government did not even release the protein sequence of this toxin because of the fact that there were no antibodies existing yet. So maybe more out there too. So we have 3 type A toxins on the market, Botox, of course, and then Dysport and Xeomin are 2 other type A toxins. There's 1 type B toxin, MyoBlock, that's been on the market. Should also point out Dysport and Xeomin were used in Europe for years before they were used here, so they weren't really new, they just were new here. Type A and B, if you look at it, at the 3D structure of the protein, it looks very similar. If you superimpose them, it's almost exactly the same. Type B is not used a lot, so MyoBlock's not used a lot, and here's why. Because this study showed that even though that they achieved similar results in 2 groups of patients that had cervical dystonia, 1 group got Botox, 1 group got MyoBlock. Both toxins were effective. Botox tended to last a little longer, 14 weeks versus 12 weeks, but here's the big thing, safety. Much higher rates of swallowing problems or dysphagia and much higher rates of dry mouth with MyoBlock than with Botox. So I think for that reason, a lot of clinicians preferred the type A toxin, and it's always had the lion's share of the market for that reason. But there are some uses for type B still. Here's a list of the indications. Cervical dystonia is neck spasms. Y'all know what blepharospasm is. Glabellar lines, that's the indication, that's wrinkles. It's approved for upper limb spasticity, so that's when the arm can be real tense from stroke or brain or spinal cord injuries or having cerebral palsy and some other conditions. Excessive sweating, which is called hyperhidrosis, it's approved for that. Some bladder conditions, and for chronic migraine prevention. And you see, not every toxin is approved for all of these conditions, and I have a little graph. Botox is approved for all of them. Dysport is approved for these 3. MyoBlock is only approved for cervical dystonia, and Xeomin is approved for CD, Bleph, and for cosmetic. But some doctors use Dysport or MyoBlock or Xeomin, for instance, in some of these non-approved conditions. Doctors do things that are not FDA approved all the time. So we have to, because we don't have FDA indication for every possible scenario. We use our clinical judgment. There's a lot of off-label uses of botulinum toxin, and this is a partial list. Dystonia of the face and the jaw. People have dystonia of their hands, sometimes called writer's cramp or other kind of focal dystonias. Spasmodic dysphonia is a dystonia of the voice. People have a lot of trouble speaking. Various kind of tremors, involuntary movements of the palate, tics. People have Tourette's, nystagmus, lower limb spasticity. That indication is probably coming very soon. Been used for drooling for a long time, jaw grinding, in the esophagus and the anal sphincters. It's been used for back pain. And finally, if your next door neighbor's dog is barking a lot, you can actually get Botox in the vocal cords of your neighbor's dog and it'll take care of it. So the side effects of getting botulinum toxin injection really depends on where it's being injected. If you're injected around the eyes, then you can have droopy eyelids, dry eyes, visual impairment. And this is listed on the PI, but headache and diarrhea were found in some patients. I'm not sure I understand the diarrhea part, but it's listed. For the neck or cervical dystonia, you can have swallowing problems if it kind of migrates into the swallowing muscles, neck pain and weakness. If it's injected for wrinkles, you can get headache. But in general, the main side effects are going to be related to causing excessive weakness in that area if you inject a little bit too much toxin. We know a little bit about antibodies already. We kind of heard about that. But anytime you inject something in the body, the immune system is going to try to react to it and try to neutralize it. So people theoretically can develop antibodies to the toxin once it's injected into the body. If you have antibodies, this can make the toxin useless. It can render it useless because you would be immune to it. These antibodies, if you develop them, are not necessarily lifelong. They can go away with time. As I mentioned before, when Allergan reformulated Botox in 1997, reduced the protein load by a factor of 5, and very little antibodies since then. Also, we've learned how to not get antibodies, and that is to avoid really high doses and to avoid doing it too frequently. So as long as you get it every 3 months or maybe 2.5 or 2 months is kind of pushing it, but more than that, you really increase the chance of getting antibodies. We used to test, there was a test you could send off and check for the antibodies in the blood. It's very expensive. I don't even think it's available anymore. The more practical thing to do, and Dr. Orberg mentioned this, you just inject a little bit in one of the corrugators here, and 2 weeks later you have them look in the mirror and lift their eyebrows up, and if one side is not lifting up as much where you injected, that means that the toxin's working and you're not immune. That's kind of a practical, easy thing to do. When you get injected with botulinum toxin, it starts to work after several days, and the peak effect is in about 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks. That's when side effects are most likely because that's when the weakness is the most, at the peak effect of the toxin. After that peak, gradually wears off the next 2.5 months or so, and that's why most people get it every 3 months. If you look in a microscope, it actually has effect for 6 months, but it's only relevant for 3 months, and that's why people get pretty much injected every 3 months, but sometimes people can be injected longer intervals. Some people can get every 3, 4, 5 months. And one more point, injecting a higher dose doesn't make it last longer. Some people think that. This warning, I'm not picking on Botox, even though this is from the Botox slide deck. All of the toxins, all 4 toxins have this black box warning, warning about distant spread of toxin effect. In other words, theoretically, if you inject a high enough dose, it can start to affect other muscles in the body and cause weakness everywhere. And there's a scary word here, reports of death. They used to not even be in the label, but it was possibly linked to a few children who had died. They were getting very high doses, way more than was FDA approved. These kids were neurologically devastated. They had severe cerebral palsy, spasticity, seizures. The injections were helping them, but these children often, don't live into adulthood. And so when these kids died, and they were getting injections every 3 months, so some people said, well, hey, did the Botox have something to do with it? That's why the warning's on there. But I'm not aware of any adult being injected with anywhere near FDA-approved dose by regulated toxin having any kind of problem. So it's actually very extensive safety record, which we're going to talk about. These are other warnings that are in the label for all the toxins, not just Botox. If somebody is known to be allergic to Botox, of course you don't want to inject them. That's extremely rare, by the way. I've only seen that 1 or 2 times in my 9 years doing it 3-4 times a day. There's a warning about the lack of interchangeability between toxin products. So if your doctor switches you from one brand of botulinum toxin to another, may not be able to use the same units. So there's always that warning about that in there. But really, Botox has been used, botulinum toxin has been used for 25 plus years all over the world, hundreds of thousands of patients. It's been revolutionary in the treatment of hyperactive motor conditions, really any kind of condition that causes overactivity of muscles. You can theoretically use botulinum toxin, and it's been very good. Very strong, that's kind of scary, but it's been used very safely for many years, and so it's always great to see how much this stuff has helped people. It's helped people open their eyes. It's helped people look somebody straight in the eye and not have a tremor. It's helped people be able to speak. It's helped people be able to get dressed. It's helped people, not to have tics, not to have headaches, to be able to go to the bathroom and not have incontinence. The list just goes on and on. So it's really changed people's lives. It's been a great thing to see. So thank y'all.